Welcome back to the Law School Toolbox podcast. Today, we're excited to be talking with Kate McGuinness, a former Big Law partner and Fortune 200 general counsel who started her life anew after being abruptly fired. This experience led her to study coaching and to learn about neuroplasticity, which informed her newest book, Confidence Lost, Confidence Found: How to Reclaim the Unstoppable You. Your Law School Toolbox host today is Alison Monahan, and typically I'm with Lee Burgess. We're here to demystify the law school and early legal career experience so that you'll be the best law student and lawyer you can be. Together, we're the co-creators of the Law School Toolbox, the Bar Exam Toolbox, and the career-related website Career Dicta. I also run the Girls Guide to Law School. If you enjoy the show, please leave a review or rating on your favorite listening app. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us. You can always reach us via the contact form on lawschooltoolbox.com, and we would love to hear from you. With that, let's get started. Welcome back to the Law School Toolbox podcast. Today, we're excited to be talking with Kate McGuinness, a former Big Law partner and Fortune 200 general counsel who started her life anew after being abruptly fired. This experience led her to study coaching and to learn about neuroplasticity, which we will talk about. Her newest book is Confidence Lost, Confidence Found: How to Reclaim the Unstoppable You. So welcome, Kate.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Oh, my pleasure. First off, could you just give us a little bit of background on your career path, which is, quite extensive and very impressive, so that our listeners have some context?
Sure. It has been a somewhat long road and a little bit winding also. After I graduated from law school, I joined a big law firm, and 7.5 years later became a partner. After 10 years as a partner, I was recruited by a Fortune 200 to be their general counsel and vice president. That turned out not to be as happy a situation as I had hoped, and I was quite abruptly fired. So there's my legal career. I decided after that termination whether I wanted to go back into law, whether I wanted to be a general counsel, and subject to the capricious determinations of others. So I decided to write, and I produced a novel, Terminal Ambition, a Maggie Mahoney novel, which I wrote and set in a big law firm. My intent of the novel was to educate women about what constitutes sexual harassment and what constitutes gender discrimination. This was in 2012, long before the Me Too movement. And I think the book achieved its educational goal. There were about 30,000 downloads. I felt good about that. Things changed suddenly when the corporation that was paying me severance, reparations for having been so abruptly fired, that corporation went bankrupt. And that dramatically changed my life. I ended up selling the ranch I lived on in California wine country. I retreated to Iowa, lived in a small town in Iowa, and found, I'm a Californian at heart. And focused on, what can I do to come back to California? And the answer I found was to study executive coaching. And I was in a 7-month program and learned a whole lot about psychology and principally about neuroscience and mindfulness. And that knowledge led me to make some changes personally, and it underlies the book, Confidence Lost, Confidence Found: How to Reclaim the Unstoppable You.
Yeah, I've read Terminal Ambition. I think it's a great book. I've handed it out to numerous people who sometimes find themselves in these situations. And if people want to find out more about you and about the book, various books, how can they do that?
Probably the best site is katemcguinness.com. Also, there's information about me, of course, on LinkedIn. And I have an Instagram account and, a Twitter account and a Facebook account.
Don't we all these days?
That's right.
All right, so go check out Kate's website. I'm sure you're linked to everything else there. All right, well, tell me a little bit about this new book. What made you want to write a book about confidence?
I was primarily inspired by my clients. As I said, I learned to be a coach, an executive coach, and I've dedicated my practice to women. It's called empoweredwomen.com. See, I'm still committed to those issues that motivated me to write Terminal Ambition. And I heard too often from my clients that they didn't feel like they had deserved their success. Maybe it was just luck. Maybe they got it because they knew someone. In other words, they didn't believe in themselves. And really, having that ability to believe in yourself, having self-assurance, is what lets us go ahead and achieve our goals. And because of what I had learned in coaching and what I had applied to myself, I was my own first case, I guess you could say.
Well, aren't we always? I sometimes joke I created the Girls Guide to Law School website because I wanted to read it when I was a law student and it didn't exist. So
exactly.
And what do you really mean by confidence? I mean, you kind of alluded to this in your prior answer, but what are we talking about here?
Confidence is a sense that you will generally be able to accomplish the goals you set for yourself in life. Not every goal, but that in general, you will be able to achieve what you set out to do.
Interesting. So maybe I should just reframe my goals and I'll be more confident. So I've had a chance to review the book, and one of the things I like about it is that you frame this really as more reclaiming your confidence rather than this being something you have to go out and create from scratch. Why do you think about it that way?
Well, I started thinking about it that way for myself. The experience of having been fired, of losing my severance and losing my ranch here in California, all of those things had combined to really lower my confidence to a point that was pretty uncomfortable. And I saw the process for myself. Yeah, I still had confidence when I was living in this Iowa farm town, and confidence, enough confidence that I signed up to be an executive coach, that I knew I could succeed and graduate from that program. So it was for me a question of taking the core of confidence that still existed and how I could boost it. And that's what I hope this book will let people do. It's not that they have no confidence, but it's a way to boost or amplify the confidence you do have.
Right. And I think this is, particularly relevant when I was thinking about this to women who I know there are studies showing, when girls become adolescents, they tend to have a huge drop off in confidence, and, they just are not the same confident kids that they were. And I think for a lot of people that lingers for a very long time. And then also to law students, we talk to so many law students who are getting ready to graduate or have graduated, and they're just saying, look, nobody's going to give me a job. Like, I have nothing to offer. And these are people who are very confident before they started this school. So it's always been very interesting to me. And a lot of that, we work with students, when they're looking for jobs and things too. And a lot of that really is going back to like, okay, what did you think you were good at before you started law school?
Exactly.
The school sort of beats the confidence out of people, unfortunately.
Yes, it does. Fortunately, I had a good experience in law school. Not cheery, but I was successful. And that let me start law practice with confidence. But I agree with you. The experience of being in law school and starting at a new job really can drain people.
Well, I just remember thinking, well into my second or third years, like being completely convinced I was going to fail certain exams. I had, classmates were like, "This is ridiculous. Like, you're on law review. You're not going to fail property."
Right.
But yeah, I was just like, "Oh, there's no way. Like, I'm never going to pass this." I mean, obviously I did, but I think there's something about that experience that really does bring people down a lot. Not always, but in a lot of cases, at least sometimes.
Well, it seems like for I think all of us, law school becomes a constant test. Whether the test is, am I going to put up my hand to answer this question in class, or is it the final? I mean, it's an ongoing test or
right. Yeah, I guess they kind of frame it that way. Even it's your boot camp for life or whatever.
That's excellent. I mean, one of the things that I thought about law practice and trying to make partner is it becomes like running through a viscous fluid and trying to jump hurdles.
That sounds delightful.
But to some extent, that is law school, and certainly being in a big firm and trying to, get up there and grab that gold ring of being a partner.
Right, which is getting harder and harder. So I think, that's even another test. Like, okay, great, you graduated from law school, you're top of your class. Now you're in this firm environment where you're back at the bottom again. So why do you think it's so important for people to feel confident? And what are some signs that maybe people do need to start working on their particular confidence?
Well, that's a great question. And I've been struck in writing this book and finding studies where again and again, people who succeed in getting a job are people who convey confidence. That in making a hiring decision, confidence becomes more important than competence.
Yeah, unfortunately.
Right.
We try to structure our hiring process intentionally to make people be competent too. But, it's definitely one of those things like, when you have an interview-based hiring system and nothing else, I think it is so much like, can you sell this? Like, are you a good interviewer?
And that's one of the sections I included in my book. I certainly have general theories of how to become confident. What are the specific things you can do to increase your confidence? What are the things you should stop doing that drain your confidence? But then I do have a few chapters toward the end of the book on specific situations that require confidence, such as interviewing for a job, such as giving a speech, receiving a performance review. Now there's one that's really loaded.
Right, definitely. No, I think all those chapters are super interesting too, because they're very sort of practical, actionable things that you can do rather than just be confident. It's like, well, what does that mean in the context of I'm going into a performance review and I'm not sure how it's going to go?
And that was my goal, to really help people. It was, okay, I've got a performance review. I remember there's a chapter on that in the book. Let me go and pull the book off.
Right. I think these are things that everybody needs a strategy for, certainly I've definitely helped friends and family members and things like that prep for their performance review. Like, okay, well, what are we going to do if this happens? What are you going to do if that happens? What are you going to say if this happens? What are you trying to put out there? All these kind of things. It's not like you just have to kind of go in and you're going into like the paper shredder, which is sometimes how I think people think about it. Right.
Well, it's a challenging situation. So my goal was to try and make that easier.
No, I think you succeeded for sure. Well, talk to me a little bit about the science behind this, because we mentioned this in the intro. Can we really transform our brains and our thinking?
And that's one of the things that I absolutely love. I was very excited as I studied psychology as part of my coach's training to find out about neuroplasticity. Yes, we can change our brain at any age. And the way that happens is, to put it in very simple terms, neurons that fire together wire together. So if you can begin to associate a task with a sensation. So if you have the experience of being confident, sometimes it can be as simple as being able to clear the shredder, the paper jam out of your printer, or opening a bottle of champagne. You have that experience. That's a confident state. And if you can have that confident state again and again, your brain will begin to wire in the sensation of being confident.
That's so interesting. It sounds a little bit like a book we read and talked about on a podcast previously, I think this year, by someone called Dan Siegel, which is Mindsight. And he really is talking, I think he's a doctor, and he's talking about, how our brains process information and emotion and all of these things. And it's super interesting.
Yeah, when I discovered neuroscience, I thought, I should change my career. But I think it's
right.
a little bit late for that. But I certainly enjoy the things that I'm able to read in that field.
Well, I guess you can always apply that, to the legal practice and help some, lawyers be happier, more effective people, possibly your next career. Yeah. And so using this idea, I mean, what are some of the ways that people are presumably, I guess, unintentionally reducing their confidence by doing things that, maybe are training their brain in these negative patterns?
Oh, that's a very good way of putting it, because we can actually create almost like furrows in our brain that reinforce negative emotions. So, for example, if every time you look in the mirror and you look at yourself and you say, "Oh God, I'm so fat," if you say that every time you look in the mirror, well, you've created a neural pathway. Or if you get an assignment and you say, "Oh my God, I'm never going to be able to do this. I screwed up the last assignment I got from this partner." Again, you have created a real negative groove in there.
Yeah, some of this sounds almost like what, at least my understanding is, people are doing with cognitive behavioral therapy of, kind of reframing. And it sounds like, I'll admit, the first time I heard about this, I was like, oh, that doesn't sound like that would work. But then I've sometimes tried some of these techniques and I find they really are effective.
Yeah, and I mean, it is amazing. And it's a delight, actually, when I see it work with my clients, to see people be able to change how they approach challenges. Challenges become opportunities instead of threats.
Right. No, I definitely think, having run a business for a while now, there's always this moment every time we take on a new project where first, I think Seth Godin talks about this at some point, the dip, in the beginning, you're all excited. You're like, yay, this is going to be so great. It's going to be really easy. And then you get to that part where you're like, oh, wow, this is really not easy. But now, we kind of recognize that as part of the process and just push through the dip. I think he has a whole book on this, but, there is that, it's really like, this is what's happening, but then there's also how we're perceiving it and the story that we're telling ourselves about it. And I think that's such an important shift for people, to really understand that whatever story you're telling, I don't want to say it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, but often it kind of is.
Oh, that's a wonderful point. I think there are a couple of places in my book where I talk about, look at your story. Sit down and maybe it's just 2 or 3 sentences, maybe it's 2 or 3 pages, and talk about the story of your life. But it's so important as you do that to not have it be a narrative of victimhood.
Right, like I'm a failure, all these things happen to me, I'll never get over them. It's like, okay, that's probably not helpful. Like I've told that story myself for, and I'm like, okay, I recognize this is probably not a helpful narrative.
Right. I mean, in my case, for example, here I was partner, general counsel. Oh boy, whoopee, aren't I special? Get fired. Oh, get a severance. That's pretty good. I live on a nice ranch. I write a book. Well, that's still pretty good. And then wham.
Yeah, you definitely got hit by some challenging situations.
But when I think of that as my narrative, then it's perhaps a narrative of victimhood, but when I look at it as a whole, and I can tell you quite honestly, Alison, the thing that I learned the most from in my life was being fired.
Interesting.
So that is my personal reframing, and that's something I think as people are struggling, it might be worthwhile for them to take some time and think about what their own narrative is.
Right. And I think so many times as lawyers and even law students, we are motivated in some ways by these external factors of like, oh, I've achieved this goal, or I've achieved this position. I'm a partner. I'm a general counsel. Yay. And then, when that's taken away, I think you have to sort of evaluate more like, well, who am I now? What am I really about? And I think at least my experience of, leaving big law and whatever became much more of like an internal journey of like, oh, okay, that's not me anymore. So what am I now? And, I think that's an interesting sort of progression to have to go through.
Right. I mean, it definitely is. And one of the things that I try and bring out in my book is that I had confidence when I was the partner, I was the general counsel. And in fact, a lot of that confidence had grown out of the approval of other people. Mm-hmm. All of the gold stars I had won over years of school and career success So that confidence was what I think of as conditional confidence.
Okay.
When I had the condition of receiving gold stars and approval and pats on the head. And what I have created now is authentic confidence, sustainable confidence. And that's what I would hope for my coaching clients and for people who read the book.
Yeah, I think this authenticity piece too, I mean, I'm going to take it in a slightly different direction. I like the framing there. But also I feel like a lot of this really does come down to authenticity. And this is something Lee and I talk about a lot. I think we even have some podcasts probably about, but how do you maintain like your sense of self and your authentic being when you're in a profession that really rewards, probably not the healthiest ways of living and these external accolades and things, there's always another hoop to jump through. It's like, oh, okay, you're a partner. Great. Well, were you an equity partner? Like, are you a managing partner? It's like, when does it stop? And it kind of never stops.
Yeah. Well, I'm so glad you said that. Authenticity, I think, is really the key to becoming confident in a sustainable, genuine way. In fact, authenticity is the first sort of chapter with an action item or a plan in my book, Authenticity, and it suggests ways to get in touch with who you really are by, for example, looking at your values. And they, of course, are listed in the book, and actually on my website there are a list of values that's printable. So if people want to go through the exercise of, well, what are my 5 most important values? And sometimes that can be easy, but when you start to narrow it down, well, 3, then 2, and you begin to see that your values can come in conflict. Compassion. Oh, yes, I'm very compassionate. Success. Well, of course.
Right. Maybe those are going to be not congruent all the time.
What happens when your secretary blows a filing deadline because she had to take her child to the doctor?
Right.
Where's compassion? Where's your drive for success? How do you reconcile those?
Yeah, and I think in a high demand profession, for a lot of people, these things do often come into conflict. And, so people feel like, A, they can't sort of bring their entire selves to the office because they don't fit into this box of, what we think of as a lawyer. And that's a problem. But then, this value stuff, certainly happens all the time. One of the final reasons I quit my law firm job was when a partner told me not to go visit my dying grandmother. And I'm like, that is one of those moments of clarity and choice where you're like, well, let's see what my options are. And, literally I said to him, like, look, you can fire me if you want to, but I'm going to see my dying grandmother. Like, that is a value choice that I'm going to make, and I will risk my job over that. And in the end, like, it didn't happen, but whatever,
Right.
But, definitely there are those moments where you're like, oh, wow, okay, this is not like, really the way that I would choose for this scenario to go down.
Well, I think being a lawyer in big law especially can be an ongoing test of what are your values.
Right, and your limits.
your limits. It is very difficult. I think you made a great decision to leave.
Well, for me, I just realized like no amount of money is worth what this is doing to my life, and other people make a different decision, and that's totally fine. But I think getting clear about, what decision you're making is really the key. So you recognize like, okay, I might be giving up X, Y, and Z, but I'm getting A, B, and C. Like, I'm okay with that. But if you don't examine that ever, then I think that's when people get really miserable, because then you have kind of all of this unexpressed angst, but you're like, no, I have this high powered job. I get paid a lot. I should be happy. Right. I think I'm imagining you probably have seen clients like that in your coaching.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, I really do. People, because I focus on women, I do hear a lot of clients who are struggling with time with their family. But oh gosh, I'm on the partnership track. That's a real challenge.
Yeah, for sure. All right. Well, let's shift gears a little bit because we're getting a bit low on time, and I want to talk about this particular topic. Let's talk about perfectionism. So you have a whole chapter on this, and it is a real challenge, I think, for many law students, many lawyers. What tips do you have for people who are really struggling with their tendency towards being perfectionist?
Well, I think the first thing is to become aware that you are a perfectionist and what it is you're doing. So, for example, I find I get some bodily cues about that. I find that my neck might tighten, my jaw might tighten, and I actually, when I'm really in perfection overdrive, kind of feel it in my chest, and you can look for bodily cues. But if you're not attuned to that, you're maybe driving yourself so hard, you're not even listening to your body. And I think that's true of a lot of law students and lawyers.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, definitely. Yeah. I was on that train. I remember when I finally went to therapy after becoming clinically depressed my first year of law school. And, I'd tell her some crazy story and she'd kind of look at me and say, "Oh, how does that make you feel?" And I'd say, "Well, I think about," she's like, "That's not the question I'm asking you. I'm asking you what you feel, telling me this insane story." And I was like, "I have no idea. I don't even understand the question." Yeah. So she actually had to kind of instruct me and like, "Well, do you feel like your palms are sweaty? Do you feel like tightness in your shoulders? Do you feel your stomach?" And I was like, "Huh. That's interesting." She's like, "Yeah, that feeling is anger," or whatever it was. And I was just like, "Oh, wow. Yeah, I never," and like Dan Siegel talks about this too. It's like a sign of basically, essentially bad parenting in childhood. But, there's a lot of stuff out there on this, but I think it is something that, people who are perfectionists tend to end up in these type of professions and then are, increasingly disconnected from the signals that they're being sent.
I mean, it's interesting that you referred to bad parenting because there certainly are interesting issues, fascinating issues about, well, where does the drive for perfectionism come from? Mm-hmm. And really, perfectionism is seen as an attempt to get approval.
Right. Yeah.
And it's approval from our parents.
Yeah, I think it's Brene Brown who really was like transformative for me personally on this point, because she talks a lot about perfectionism basically being like a fear of being vulnerable and all these kind of things, but then like vulnerability is what leads to connection. And so she has this whole theory around this that I think for me was really eye-opening. I'm like, oh, so it's not just like I'm trying to be perfect because I want this project to be perfect. There's all this other stuff going on.
I mean, I think that's right. Absolutely. I think Brene Brown is really great on this topic.
Yeah, we're just hitting all the high points here. I'm like, the other one I want to bring up if people are interested is the Martha Beck on the kind of the body and all that kind of thing. Her Finding Your Own North Star was also very transformative for me personally. So I think there's so much interesting stuff out there about all these topics.
And you asked how you can tell if you're a perfectionist. And we talked about the bodily signs, and I think that's really important. And sometimes as a lawyer, you might wake up and find yourself, how many times have I revised this document? Have I put back in a sentence I already took out? How many times has that sentence rotated through my brief? Those kind of things really, if you're a little bit aware, may key you off that, yeah, I'm a perfectionist.
Right, and sometimes people hear that and they think, well, of course I'm a perfectionist. I want to be perfect, but that's not really what we're talking about here. It's more like, are you spinning your wheels in a way that is not producing results, really?
I think perfectionism can become an addiction. And you talk about spinning your wheels. The single instance that I most recollect was I had an associate, mid-level associate, good associate, go through a 100-page document to make sure at the end of each sentence there was only one period.
Okay, I will admit that is my own personal peeve. So I'm also like, you could use find and replace on that. But right. I mean, I think it's a hard line because for me, like, I want there to be one period, and like I go nuts on our website or whatever. If people, I mean, not nuts, I try to, constrain it, but I do make them change it. And so I think, we want to have high standards, but at the same time, I realize I can't hold up an entire project and I can't review every single blog post for double spaces, even though I would prefer they not be there. Like, that's just not practical.
Well, and at some point, you also should look at the value of perfectionism.
Right. Is this really changing
What does
anything?
This add to the project?
Yeah.
And if you look at that in the context of practicing law, well, what was the value of her task with the periods? Well, it was I had to discount that time. I couldn't charge the client for the time.
$300 an hour to like see if there's double spacing after a period. Yeah, they would probably not be happy about that.
No.
Yeah, but I mean, that is one of those things that I notice because I have a design background too, and I just see these things and it does actually drive me insane. But I've also learned to recognize that it's not something I should be spending that much time on.
Yeah. But I mean, I would suggest that to people who think of themselves as perfectionist, and how can I stop, is if they can think about what's the cost of what I'm doing and what's the value. You know,
Right.
does my son really have to have a birthday cake that looks like a Trier engine? Should I spend my time doing that, or should I spend my time talking to him, reading to him?
Or can I outsource that project to somebody who actually
Exactly.
wants to do it?
Right.
Yeah, no, I think it's about choosing your battles for sure. I mean, unfortunately, the double space after the period is kind of a hill I'm willing to die on, but not every day. All right.
Well,
okay.
I'm sorry I picked up such a sensitive topic.
No, it is one of those ones. But again, like I recognize that like that is triggering for me. And I'm like, okay, you are being crazy about this. You need to just, ask someone to revise this document with the find and replace and then move on with your life and assume that they'll do it. Well, unfortunately, we're about out of time, but I'm just curious. What have you mentioned earlier that you kind of wrote this book arising out of the things you were learning, but to what extent have you applied these to your own life? I mean, are you feeling more confident these days?
Oh, wow. I definitely am. Having lived in this strange town in Iowa and then coming back to California after a 5-year absence, for example, making new friends, that requires confidence. And sometimes if you don't have confidence, being in social situations, new social situations, can be something you want to avoid. So I've found that as my confidence has grown, that I become much more comfortable with those sorts of situations. And just a quick example of how am I using the tools that are in the book. I recently recorded an audio version of Confidence Lost, Confidence Found. And the first first hour was a little rocky. And I felt uncomfortable with that. And then I remembered the power of the word yet, which is featured in the book under growth mindset. So I remembered, okay, this hour is a little rocky. It's because I haven't learned to do this yet. And once I told myself that, it let me go forward with confidence. It meant, oh yes, I will learn how to do it. I haven't done it yet.
No, I think that's such a great way of framing it. People sometimes think like, I didn't do so well on this first semester exam, so I'm just bad at law school. And it's like, well, no, you just haven't learned these skills that you need yet. You can learn them.
Yeah, if you want to get a tattoo of yet and put that on your wrist.
I love it. No, it's a really great way of framing it, I think, because it just does make you think like, what are those steps I need to do? Or just even time and practice and, repetition is going to make this easier. All right, Kate, well, thank you so much for joining us. Any final thoughts you'd like to share with people on this topic?
Well, I would encourage people to think about the power of yet, to really believe in themselves. They can achieve the goals that they set out for themselves.
All right, great. I think that's a great point to end on. And let's just remind people, how can they connect with you and get the book if they're interested?
KateMcGuinness.com is a good source, and the book, you can buy the book on Amazon or you can buy it in independent bookstores, and there also is an audiobook. So I encourage you to pick your favorite medium.
Nice. Well, I've taken a look at the book. I think it's fantastic. It really does summarize a lot of the science in a very approachable way, and it's very actionable. So I think people will enjoy it and find it useful. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Kate.
Oh, thank you. I very much enjoyed it.
My pleasure. If you enjoyed this episode of the Law School Toolbox podcast, please take a second to leave a review or rating on your favorite listening app. We would really appreciate it. And be sure to subscribe so you don't miss anything. If you have any questions or comments, please don't hesitate to reach out to Lee or Allison at lee@lawschooltoolbox.com or allison@lawschooltoolbox.com, or you can always contact us via our website contact form at lawschooltoolbox.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk soon.